grieving involves remembering, right? So they're going to have to be able to do that. And when those post-traumatic stress responses are in place, it's really difficult for that child to process grief in a more kind of typical way. And so that's where the focus on traumatic grief and really making sure that we have an understanding of what this might look like for that child or adolescent. That's where this becomes really critical. Some of the ways that we see this as different than more of a sort of typical grief reaction is the intrusive memories, is the avoidance, that numbing, some of those psychosomatic symptoms. A lot of those are very unique to traumatic grief and not to kind of the typical grief that one might go through, right, around the loss of a loved one in a different matter. The other piece is the traumatic grief. This results from that sudden death and the nature of the death, right? And that's really where those struggles with post-traumatic stress, come into play. And so that's really, one of the primary differences. The other is that children who have experienced intimate partner homicide, they're experiencing multiple losses, and oftentimes these are simultaneous losses. So they've lost a parent to the homicide. If the perpetrator was also their primary caregiver, they've lost that parent as well, either to incarceration, suicide, or fleeing. So there's this simultaneous loss of two caregivers. And then oftentimes there's these other losses that result from the intimate partner homicide, like having to move into a new home, having a new primary caregiver. Sometimes siblings are separated. They're potentially, if they're in a new neighborhood, they might have to be in a new school. So there's these multiple pieces that go with this traumatic event they've already experienced. Multiple and simultaneous losses is something that is also unique to this type of trauma, which can amplify the traumatic grief as well. And then the one other piece I think ties into the traumatic grief and being able to sort of work through that is that there's a lot of complex issues that this child or adolescent is having to consider and evaluate and work through associated with that offending parent. So if it was, their parent or their primary caregiver that was the perpetrator, there can be a lot of ambivalent feelings, right, about that parent. So oftentimes what we see is that, that parent was at times a good parent, right? They, showed care and concern and love for the child, but they did a really horrible thing. And so, for a child to kind of make sense of that and figure out what does that mean for me? How does that impact my own identity? How does what this other caregiver did, someone who was capable of murdering my other parent, and if I'm related to that person, what does that mean about who I am, right? So a lot of times issues around loyalty, identity, just ambivalent feelings, all of that really ties into this traumatic grief as well.